Okay, thank you everyone for selecting to be part of our conversation today. We have, I would say, someone that is an expert in the field. We have Kira Denny with us. She has presented for us before, and we are so excited today because I think it's a really interesting topic that I have not seen anything out there for yet. So we're going to be talking about the intersection of eating disorders and human trafficking. So welcome, Kira.
Thank you so much. I'm excited for this topic and yeah, you're right. There's not much out there. And yeah, doing even this research was very hard, but there's definitely hopefully developments with it.
Yes, that's great. So I'm just going to give our quick housekeeping and bios, and then I want to spend most of our time just diving in talking to Kira. So my name is Megan Mitchell. I'm a child and adolescent therapist in Washington, D.C. I actually now live in Michigan and I have my own private practice. So that is a newer development since what you see here. I um I am finishing up my doctorate in social work in May. Obviously that I have the Agents of Change test prep, but we have grown our continuing education platform. And now I was just talking with Kira, we are approved for CE credits for social workers and through NBCC. So we can open it up to the whole mental health community. And a little bit about what I do. I work with kids, um, primarily ages like 4 to 18 on a variety of different things. And then in my doctoral program, I'm focusing on multicultural supervision, how we can make supervision more intentional. I'm really passionate about effective and quality supervision. And I know Kira supervises too, so we could have a whole nother conversation about that. So there's just lots of different things that I got my hands into. And then I'm going to tell you about Kira. Kira is the co-founder and co-owner of Pro Wellness. And then this is a newer thing since she last chatted with us. She's the practice and clinical director for Monte Walden. Is that correct? Am I saying it correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Inpatient eating disorder unit, and she is up in Massachusetts. She does everything around eating disorders, disordered eating, body image, and she's licensed in a bunch of states, which is cool. And then she does a lot of CBT work, which is I do a lot of CBT work too, so I very much appreciate that. And she does podcasts, she puts content out there, so she's doing a lot of different things. And then when she's not doing this stuff in her free time, she does mentoring, mindful movement, and watching and playing sports, reading and hanging out with family. And we bonded over our love for sports last time, so it's been a very very busy football season for me and my family. That's like all we watch. Up here in Michigan, the Detroit Lions um,
Fair.
are still in it, so we are very football focused right now.
Very nice. Yeah. Unfortunately, my team is no longer in the playoffs. They were bounced out first round, but that's okay.
You can be a Lions fan. We will take you. So.
Appreciate it.
So let's go over our learning objectives for today. Participants will be able to recognize key indicators and vulnerabilities. So she's going to talk about like who would be vulnerable to experience this intersection of eating disorders and human trafficking. How would you assess for this? I'm super interested because I would not even know what questions to ask or like what signs there are. She's going to talk about applying trauma-informed practices, minimizing re-traumatization, and I can imagine there's lots of layers and complexities to this topic. So she'll talk a little bit about that. And then how can you be collaborative and use community resources for survivors? And she'll talk a little bit about the recovery process. So why is this topic important? I think that, like I said, it's not out there. So I think it's probably very important that as mental health practitioners, we are just becoming more aware of this intersection. I'm very, very curious, and I know Kira has lots of information to share with us, but how do eating disorders and trafficking interplay with each other, right? Of course, we want the best for our clients and client populations. So it's important because we want improved survivor outcomes. How can we be trauma informed? If we have a client that is experiencing this, what strategies can we use? And then the biggest thing I think today is raising awareness. It's a very, I don't even know if it's overlooked. I think people just probably were not even aware. So you will
Mhm.
be aware, made aware after this today. And Kira's going to share more with us, but I can probably make the assumption that it's more common than we think. And
Mhm.
she will share a little bit more about that. So I'm very, very excited to have Kira here today. Thank you for being with us, Kira.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited for this discussion.
Yeah, so we'll just get into to I guess a little bit more of background. You have been working with eating. That's really been your niche since grad
Mhm.
school, correct?
Yeah, it's been eating disorders and as well as human trafficking kind of tandem together at different organizations and different things. And through that work, I started to notice some similarities and shared vulnerabilities. And, we'll get into a little bit more, but kind of how eating disorders present in terms of like control and
Yeah.
individuals that are part of trafficking and the control that they either seek or that is taken away from them. And so yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, so you kind of that's what's so great about being in the mental health field. We have these different interests and oftentimes they do intersect, right? There's so
Mhm.
many intersections with so many different mental health topics. So, what kind of made you think a little bit deeper? I have this expertise here, I have this expertise here. What made you think a little bit more deeply about, wow, there is an intersection and I'd like to bring awareness to this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to, if it's okay to start with, kind of recognizing that we are going to be talking about some
Yes.
sensitive and triggering topics when it does come to human trafficking, potentially some sexual assault, domestic violence, and other related issues, and just wanting the individuals that are obtaining this information just to recognize that these can evoke some strong emotions. And so
Yes.
definitely please take care of yourself and prioritize as we kind of go through this. But yeah. So a little bit about myself is like you were saying, Megan, is that I've worked with eating disorders even like since I was in grad school. I did my internship, had a job at an eating disorder center. Um, and then through that work with eating disorders, really enjoyed it, but took kind of I was in Florida at the time, decided to go to DC. And while I was there, I worked actually for the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And in addition to that, I started to be like, wait, I really want to do maybe like therapy or case management for like actual, like the actual like victims, because the National Human Trafficking Hotline is where people kind of call in and give tips or kind of need resources. So it's very hands off, but it's still very direct because we are sometimes or it was rather, when I was there, dealing with in the immediate, imminent risk and danger at that time. And so I was like, oh, I'd really like to kind of do the after part of being with those people and kind of through that work, like I said, having worked with eating disorders. But then when I started to work for an organization where I was providing therapy to survivors and victims of human trafficking, some similarities of like food restriction, body image, drug use, things like that were coming up. And kind of as I started to see more survivors, and I was still, working in eating disorders, I was like, wait, there is quite an overlap in what I'm seeing. And so that kind of led me to wanting to see what's out there. And like I said at the beginning of this, unfortunately, there's not much intersection research that has been done in regards to human trafficking and eating disorders. And I think that's really what this is about. It's just the awareness of what that can look like, and hopefully through the years seeing the development of research and resources and ways to manage when you are sitting across from someone who may be experiencing both or has experienced both.
Yeah. And I like that you brought up that you worked for the hotline because I've seen those signs in bathrooms and airports. So I think people are aware at that level, right? That there
Hmm.
are hotlines and stuff you can call. But even in the mental health, it's a very small portion of practitioners that really are equipped to work with human trafficking survivors. So I think that's
Hmm.
really an important area. And it, I'm so glad there's more public awareness too, because that's a newer phenomenon, I would say, too, is seeing the signs. If
Hmm.
you suspect something, please call. So hopefully moving more in the right direction for more support. So
Yeah.
I will open it up to our first question. So what are some of the vulnerabilities someone might have who is who has been involved with human trafficking, and how might they be at risk for disordered eating, or what are some of the risk factors you might be checking for or assessing for?
Yeah, I mean, kind of some overlapping demographics and vulnerabilities that you may see is going to be gender, age, adolescents and young adults, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and race. When we think about women and girls, they may face higher risk for both trafficking and eating disorders due to the societal pressures related to body image and gender-based violence. So that's where that intersection is. And then when we think about, by non-binary and transgender individuals, there's that marginalization and that discrimination, and so they are more vulnerable, wanting that acceptance. And that's, something when we think about human trafficking, there's something called the action, means, and purpose model. And so that's kind of like the way that a perpetrator may utilize to engage someone in their the trafficking situation. And so when we think about these vulnerable populations, they're the ones that they're kind of seeking or grooming.
So I have a question regarding trafficking. Do
Mhm.
you, I'm not familiar with this at all. So is it common that people get into a situation where there's obviously power and control? There's definitely always a power dynamic, but
Mhm.
ever get into situations where people are maybe not even aware that they are part of trafficking, or it becomes this power and control relationship? So tell us a little bit about how someone might get involved with human trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I can kind of just go back a little bit and kind of just give like what human trafficking is and give a little bit of an overview. When we think about human trafficking, I know a lot of people are like, oh, I've seen the movie Taken. Great movie. Liam Neeson does well in that. And that is not just human trafficking.
Right.
And that is I don't want to say the severe case. That is um, not the norm, actually.
That's the
It's,
Hollywood version of
yes. Very much. That is the Hollywood version. But the U.S. law defines human trafficking as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to
it.
compel a person into commercial sex acts or labor or services against his or her will. Um, the one exception does involves when there's minors in commercial sex, including a minor into inducing, sorry, a minor into commercial sex. That's considered human trafficking regardless of the presence of the force, fraud, or coercion. Um, but going back to what you're saying, does someone always know that they're in a trafficking situation? And not necessarily, right? When we think about the different types of trafficking, there's actually a classification system that the National Human Trafficking Hotline created, and that means that there's 25 different kind of entities or types of human trafficking that can occur. Five of those are actually only identified as sex trafficking, and the other 15 are labor trafficking, and then five of those are kind of classified as both sex and labor trafficking. And I think that can be really interesting to people because really we only talk about sex trafficking and we only have like one idea. Again, I think about, or like prior to getting into this work, I always thought about like Taken. You go
Yep.
to a foreign country, a foreign place to you, and you're just taken, and it's quick and it's rapid and it's just really traumatic. I mean, the entire thing's traumatic, but it's just like very high paced, and that's not the case. A lot of times they're grooming on these people. Whether that is through when we think of labor trafficking, that can happen in regards to housekeeping. Someone that is a housekeeper and, that trafficking looks like they're not getting paid. They're working overextended hours. Um, their documents are taken and kept from them. If they try to leave, they're threatened or, so that's what kind of trafficking can look like outside of like maybe what we think or see as society as trafficking.
And I immediately think of the Hollywood version. I think of that in like Law and Order SVU or something, right? So I
Mhm.
think it's much more nuanced than that. And I think the more awareness of what in reality is happening, the better. So people know what to look out for. So thank you for kind of just taking us back to, what is trafficking, what can trafficking look like? You don't have to give any specific stats, but how common is trafficking?
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, and you would think I would with all the information, but I don't have it's a lot more common, I'll just say this,
Yes.
than we think, right? I remember a case came out from my hometown where there was someone being trafficked in a neighboring neighborhood, and no one could believe it. From you just don't think about it.
Yep.
And it definitely happens. There's that myth that it's people that you don't know. And that's not the case when we think about even other things such as sexual assault, domestic violence. A lot of times it is by someone that the survivor victim really does know. And that's the same case for labor and sex trafficking. Sometimes it's family, sometimes it's friends, sometimes it's aunts and uncles, right? Like there's a lot of that. I think there's also that myth that human trafficking is about the involvement of moving, traveling, or transporting, and
Okay.
that does not have to occur for a person to be under a trafficker.
Okay. That's helpful because you're just dispelling all the myths that I had in my head. Because, like I said, I'm a novice to this.
Mm-hmm.
So, how we're talking about, the intersection, how might someone seek help if they need it? Do a lot of survivors of trafficking not seek help? How do we get them in the door to see us to get the help that they need?
Yeah. They have to reach out themselves, right? When I worked on the human trafficking hotline, so many times there would be understandably so very distraught family members and friends being like, my child, my friend, my brother, my sister, whoever it may be, is involved in this. And one, there is a part of it where like we have to decipher like, is someone truly like this is part of like what they want to be doing, or is this like truly trafficking? And we have to
Yes.
parse through that. And also going in can actually make the situation worse, right? If there
Mm.
isn't any safety planning or any contact with the victim or uh, to be able to plan that, right? Because it goes back to the means of control. And if the trafficker is feeling threatened, then they are going to amp up whatever behaviors that they are putting upon these individuals. And so you want to be very um, strategic about it, and you really need the buy-in of the victim, and sometimes that can be really hard, and whether that's because there's the cognitive delay from that of like being under such distraught and
Mhm.
trauma, whether they're being threatened themselves and they don't have the means or the access, or they're you know being denied food, which is kind of leads into some of the eating disorder part where they're being denied food, so they're cognitively malnourished to maintain this body, or it just is per just like true control. Whether they're under the influence to be able to just maintain to be able to get through kind of these situations. So there's definitely a lot of components to before you can go in and kind of take a step in. A lot of times if someone were to reach out to the hotline, it's about giving them resources that they can then connect with, whether that is, safety first. Let's get you safe. We can't even do any of like the work until we know you have, and I think we're gonna talk about this a little bit later, but like Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Yep.
you need shelter, you need food. If those are the most two important things that we can do, and safety before we can do anything else.
Yeah. And I'm just think it's so interesting that you said oftentimes family members would call because I'm thinking of, I'm sure sometimes some of these people are so deep into it and they're psychologically manipulated and controlled that family members are like, we need help, but the person that is being trafficked is in such a power situation that they could have manipulation, psychological manipulation. And if
Hmm.
people are controlling even their basic needs, access to basic needs, it's going to be really hard for them to reach out for help. And it's probably very scary and it can be very risky, I would assume. Is that accurate?
Yeah, very much so. And kind of thinking about this, right? Like the involvement or individuals that are involved in at risk for eating disorders and human trafficking do share some of those psychological vulnerabilities, such as, low self-esteem, a history of trauma, difficulty setting boundaries. Socially, maybe they experience isolation and lack of support system and economic instability. And so when someone is telling them, hey, I can get you this if you do this for me, and it sounds great until you're under their control, and all of a sudden you have no control, you have no autonomy. And that again, we see that in relation to eating disorders when someone is engaged in their eating disorder, whatever that disorder is. We think about anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, all those different types. They no longer really have the autonomy that they think they have. the eating disorder is the thing that is controlling them. Um, but yeah, I think, kind of recognizing that psychological vulnerability.
Yeah. So I think you did a really good job of covering that. So when you get these people in, they're doing the work, right? They're into the therapeutic space. We're working through this stuff. How how do we assess? How do we maybe pick up on some signs that there is disordered eating occurring?
Yeah. Yeah, so for disordered eating, you said, like if they're in
Yeah.
the space of like seeking, yeah,
Yep, we
definitely.
have a survivor. They're here.
Mhm.
How do we maybe pick up on some of the risk factors or signs that they may be experiencing eating disorder or disordered eating?
Yeah. One thing I always like to say is that you cannot tell that someone has an eating disorder just by looking at them.
Exactly.
Eating disorders, again, in the same way that human trafficking, it can be anyone in any body, any demographic, any diversity, right? Like anybody can be vulnerable to it. And so when we're sitting across from someone who is maybe talking about their experience of being trafficked, is okay, tell me what your routine is now. What does that look like? And you kind of hear them talking, and they're talking about, oh, I get up, I go to the gym, I talk to my mom, I talk to my dad, I kind of go to work, I go to school. And you're like, okay, so what do you do for food? And they're like, I'll have a snack here and there. Okay, well, what about dinner? What do you have for dinner? Oh, I don't really eat dinner. I'm not really hungry. And kind of like when we're thinking about trafficking victims, a lot of them that I have worked with don't eat dinner because there's like this expectation that again they either have to have a certain body size or they need to be kind of have nothing in their system so that they
Oh,
are administered unfortunately like a drug or alcohol to be under the influence to even get through that, whether that is by their own
right.
will or at the will of their trafficker, right? And so like their body is adjusted to that, and so they don't recognize hunger cues and like, oh, it's 6 o'clock, I should be eating dinner, where maybe when they're in their situation, it's 6 o'clock, I'm now taking this X, Y, and Z medication to be able to go out later or to be able to make it through the night.
Are
um
there also instances where they had food had been withheld from them, so it's rebuilding that relationship around safety
yeah.
of food?
Yeah, absolutely, right? So that can be another thing where that can just be again, a means of control for just body image or just a means of control
Right.
that they don't want individuals to be eating. And so again, like they have to relearn that of it's okay to eat. I'm allowed to eat. I can choose what I eat. And
Mm.
that's another part of it, right? They may not even know what to eat or how to eat because sometimes people are being trafficked at such a young age, whether that's 15, 16, and they haven't even developed just life skills. And by the time they're out of their situation at, 22, 23, maybe 30s, they've had someone else doing everything for them. Not in any way a healthy way, but that then they're now having to relearn how to be an adult in society at that point and for themselves.
Yeah. So obviously, if someone is involved in trafficking, that is traumatic in and of itself, and there would be different layers and levels of trauma. How does trauma contribute to the development of disordered eating? Where's the intersection of, there's another intersection, right? There's always intersections.
Yeah.
Trauma and development of disordered eating.
Yeah, a way to cope, a means to control, right? You going through something traumatic, your body doesn't feel like you're connected to it, but if you start to eat something, you're like, oh, I feel that in my body, or it's a way of numbing. I don't feel anything, I can eat whatever. So that's really how that can come up, and then there's like this dissociation piece. If I'm already dissociated, I can engage in these behaviors.
Yeah. I'm looking at some of the myths that you have. What are some common myths that you see around individuals that are involved in trafficking? Or like
Yeah,
ones that you have to dispel where you're like, that is, a myth.
yeah. And I mean, other than some of the ones that I've named,
Right.
definitely one that comes up very often is that it doesn't happen within the US, that it's a foreign thing, it's
Hmm.
undocumented individuals. And that is not the case. I mean, does that happen? Absolutely. and I think you'll be sharing a PowerPoint, but in that PowerPoint, there's a map of all the different areas in the world where human trafficking has been identified and resources that are there as well. But just recognizing that it is not one place or another because it happens everywhere. So I think that's a big thing that people are like, oh, well, that can't happen to me or that wouldn't happen in the US. And unfortunately,
I'm looking at it
and
right now. It happens in the US. It is
yes,
actually there's
uh,
a very large circle where it shows that
mhm.
it's occurring in the United States.
Yeah, and one thing I know, I've lived in DC and I know you're from that area as well or spent some time there. It's very common that train stations is where a lot of trafficking can happen because there is, while traveling and movement is not necessarily mean that trafficking is happening or that that has to be a part of a trafficking situation. That is a very easy place where people are able to get from location to location. So if you think about major transit places such as train stations, Union Station in DC, we think about, Grand Central Station, is there,
Airports.
yeah, there's actually great because they can get people, to and from. And that's really an interesting piece of it because again, a lot of times in a trafficking situation, someone's holding their documents, but that's kind of the one time that maybe they can have their documents or they get it for a little period of time. Um, but because they're under, this constant control, they don't even recognize like, oh wait, like this might be the time that I can get out of this. I can
Mhm.
go to someone, or I finally have my documents back. And so I think that's really important. And that's in the same way with food as well.
Mhm.
When they're given food, it's like, oh wait, can I have this? Oh wait, I could go get this now. It's having to relearn that they have that autonomy and they have that decision making ability.
Yeah. And I think this is probably a myth. I'm guessing it happens more commonly just due to population size and access to transportation in big cities, but it can happen anywhere.
Mhm. Yeah,
I'm sure that's a myth too. Oh, it only happens in certain cities.
yeah. That's a big myth that in that people being trafficked are physically being unable to leave their situation, right? When we're
Mm.
talking about this, like we want to think about that they're being held again, their documents. Oh, if you leave, we're gonna kill your family. We're going to, if you leave, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, right? There's so many different things that could happen, right? When we think about trafficking, sometimes they are having to engage in things that are illegal. And so with that being said, they can hold that, be like, oh, we'll go to X, Y, and Z
Yep.
about this, and you will no longer do that. And that again is where it's different for minors. But yeah, it's a really just controlling environment. And it's that psychological manipulation, it's isolation. But they don't necessarily have to be physically held to be under. I mean, I worked with individuals who lived at home and were being trafficked, not even by the people in their home, but they were being trafficked when they weren't at their home.
Yep.
And so like recognizing that they don't have to be at another location either.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really important thing too. It's just I have this image in my head and you're breaking down every image I have in my head because that's not what it is. So we were talking before about trauma and the different intersections. So you've talked about the trauma. Can you talk a little bit more about isolation and lack of support? How does that play into how we would work or what might be coming up when we're working with someone that is has been involved in trafficking?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the vulnerabilities, right, that we talked about when we think about, especially on the socioeconomic status or marginalized communities where resources are already not robust, and then you take something so niche as human trafficking and then eating disorders, it's not, that's not there. We also think about health equity and like, do they have resources such as insurance and the funds to be able to even seek treatment? What does it look culturally? There's a lot of times where it's like you don't talk about what's going on in certain cultures, or if you do, you're considered weak, you're considered X, Y, and Z. And so recognizing that there are those barriers that people are involved in that they can't seek that. And also, again, going back to what you're saying is that trafficking and eating disorders don't just happen in major cities, it's happening everywhere. So if it's happening in a region where the population is, 2, 3,000 people, there probably is not going to be many other resources in terms
Or
of mental
yeah.
health and doctors. And that's another thing when we think about like control and manipulation is that sometimes individuals who are hurt or something, they're denied medical care because if they go to medical care, medical providers might ask a question that could set some like alarms up. And so they're denied that. And so that also leads to some of that eating disorder stuff as well, is that, you know, they're not eating because they're getting sick all the time. And maybe, they're not eating because of that, and so they're not going to a doctor to figure out what's going on. And so yeah, there's definitely a lot of barriers to that is in terms
I'm
of getting the resources.
I'm just thinking how many hoops it would take to get through to get someone the help,
Mhm.
the quality help that they need. It would be very, very, very challenging. So awareness is key, and just getting people to know, like, here are some of the signs is really important. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit more about the shame that someone might be experiencing that would be a barrier to getting them any sort of support too, and how that
Yeah,
ties into disordered eating?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the shame again, is it a cultural thing just to even seek support? There's that, and then also with eating disorders, right? We know that eating disorders root in shame and secrecy. And so if that's the one thing that they feel they have control over, when they're already feeling shame over their current situation of being controlled in a human trafficking situation, they're going to hold on to that. And so that's where that shame really then manifests, and that's where the eating disorder becomes a major issue or a major barrier um, to certain things that they need.
And I'm going to share a slide deck that Kira has done. So there'll be a lot more information on some of the ways you can assess and some tools. But my question is, Kira, if we get someone, should we be asking like just some baseline questions in the intake? How do we, because I know everyone does different intake process, everyone does different. So what might be like a question you can ask to even scratch the surface on this to get into the eating and the food portion?
Yeah. So there is something that I recommend if you are ever doing any assessment and you suspect anything is doing the adult human trafficking screening tool guide. And that is anyone can give it and assess it. It is a lot of times used within like public health, behavioral health, and social work professions to and it is trauma informed and survivor informed practices again to assess like is this happening. So there's certain questions in that you can ask, but some kind of just like different areas that you can ask about is social connections, trauma and stress, physical well-being, psychological and emotional, work and activities, history and background. So with that, I can kind of break those down. So if I'm talking about history and background, I could ask, can you tell me about your living situation? Have there been times when you felt like you couldn't leave your house or your place of work if we're thinking about labor trafficking? Who do you live with? What's your relationship with them? And that can be really telling. Where do you spend most of your time? This is, you mentioned that this is your house, but is that where you're sleeping at night?
Mm.
I think that's like an additional question, right? Because sometimes people do have a place that they call home or their place, but where are they spending their time there? How often are they there? You know, I think that's again just being exploratory, but very much, coming from a just creating that safe and welcoming environment to do
Mm-hmm.
that. Because when we are working with trafficking victims as well as individuals that have eating disorders, it's about building that trust and rapport, coming from a non-judgmental and empathetic listening kind of just mindset and standpoint and just environment.
And the way you just worded that all was very non-threatening, right? It's not like, have you been trafficked before, right? Have you been
Yeah.
involved? And I think a lot of times, and this is especially for people that are new in the field, you you feel like you so have to stick to a script that the agency gives
Mhm.
you, right? Like I was not good at doing intakes when I first came into the field. And as you get more comfortable, you find different ways to approach this that are not so scary for the clients, right? Because if you ask that, they're gonna say no. I mean, some might
Yeah.
be open, but you're not gonna get it's different than the non-approaching way that you just did, which is great. And then so you explain that, then how do we get into the food piece? So we've got that, and then like how are we asking about their connection with food and all of those different.
Yeah.
Things like that.
So obviously working in eating disorders, I'm very direct and I say, what do you eat in a day? And I
Okay.
ask them to walk me through. And I do think that that's a very, especially if I'm seeing them all like that day, I'll be like, oh, what have you eaten today? And I just kind of make it casual. And and they'll say like what they've eaten. I'll be like, oh, that sounds nice. I was like, I'll have this. And I kind of just make it a conversation.
Normal.
Um, Right, exactly. Just normalizing that one, it is okay to eat. Our bodies are made to eat. Um, and I think that that's one way. Another way is, asking, what does just your day look like? Having them tell their day, and you'll notice individuals with eating disorders won't talk about food. Where
Mm,
like if someone were to ask you maybe, what'd you do yesterday? You're like, oh, I had, this training, I had to do this, had dinner with a friend, and you might mention that, right? And so that's another thing is seeing, do they even mention food? Or do they mention how much they exercise? Do they mention how much are they avoiding kind of those types of topics as well? Um, but I would say that's really a way to assess. I mean, also other ways to assess if we're looking at if they do mention that they're eating, okay, what do you eat? Do you have any fair foods? Is there anything that you feel uncomfortable eating? Um, but yeah, I would say that's kind of how you can assess a little bit from the eating disorder side.
and I every time I like meet with someone that's an expertise in some area, there's so many thoughts going on of how just generally the intake process can be so much better revamped for all. We're missing most standard intakes. We miss a lot of areas where we could get a lot of information. And we don't really ask people about eating habits or food. We just don't. So it's important to ask because food fuels our body, and we need to know what's going on with what they're putting into their body.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've talked, we kind of got we understand the background. So now let's move into trauma informed care.
Mhm.
You have demonstrated trauma informed care in many ways, right? Like even telling our listeners today, hey, this is going to be a hard topic. Take care of yourself. A lot of mental health practitioners, we know what trauma informed care is, but what does it actually look like when you're working with a specific population?
Yeah. It's some of the things that, I've listed when we're thinking about what creating a safe and warm, welcoming environment is. It's ensuring that the physical space is private and comfortable. It's being mindful of our own body language, our tone, making others feel at ease. It's asking if you're seeing people in person, if they prefer evening, morning, or afternoon appointments, right? Someone that may be in a trafficking situation might have difficulty being out at night or during early mornings or during the day. And so kind of recognizing that as well. Or again, if we're looking at it from an eating disorder standpoint, okay, let's not have you know, sessions during times that maybe they should be having a meal or having a snack. And so again, just kind of thinking about creating that safe environment. It's about, building trust and rapport. And so being consistent and reliable in your interactions. And that's a big one for individuals that are trafficked because it's such an unpredictable environment for survivors because they, a lot of times don't know what to expect. I mean, there is an element of predictability, but also they don't know what they're walking into at times, or what each day is going to look like, if they're going to get a meal, if they're going to be allowed to talk to a family member or a friend. And so again, being able to just be really consistent and reliable in that. Also explaining the purpose of
Mm,
the assessment and how the information is going to be used. I think that can be really important is that, especially when we're thinking about trafficking victims, they may have, again, engaged in things that could be illegal because they had to be able to maintain their own safety or do something for their perpetrator that was required of them. And so they might be scared to say that. So like they don't know what could come of that. And so I think being able to um share what the purpose of it is. And I say the same thing when I work with eating disorder clients is, I need you to tell me as much as you're comfortable with, and I'm always assessing to see if a higher level of care is needed. Because
yes.
especially when I'm seeing my individuals at the outpatient level, I'm always assessing every week, and I tell them that I'm like, I want you to come, I want you to feel comfortable to share. And just so you know, when I ask these questions, it's under the expectation that we have a mutual agreement that if there's something that you report that needs a higher level attention or other additional providers, then we're going to have to do that. But I say that from the beginning. I think when you do that in the beginning, then they don't feel blindsided or like, oh, I'm going to have to close up now that I said something. Because that can definitely happen a lot when you're sitting across from a patient and you haven't kind of maybe given that guideline or that expectation. They say something and you're ready to kind of be more direct or dive into it, and they recoil. They're like, oh no, that's not actually that big of a deal.
Right.
Yeah, I actually eat 3 meals a day. No, yeah, it's fine. It's not that big of a deal. It's like, okay,
And that's when
well,
your
it's
clinical spidey sense is like, something's going on here. I
yeah.
love that you brought up higher level of care because we did an ethics talk way back when where we talked about higher level of care. Some people work in higher levels of care as it is, right? An inpatient, those type of things. A lot of people though work in outpatient. And
Mm-hmm.
ethically, as any mental health provider, I love that you said you're constantly assessing and you say this from the beginning. It is times not appropriate for them to be seen in an outpatient because it's not enough. It's not
Mm-hmm.
meeting the needs. So I love that you said that from the beginning, building that rapport and just letting them know I'm always assessing. If we need a higher of level of care, we're going to discuss this because I often see I do supervision, I talk with people. There's a lot of hesitancy to refer to a higher level of care because there's shame on the part of the clinician, right? Like, why can't I
Mm-hmm.
do this? I can do this, right? But you need to take a step back from that. It's nothing personal. If they need a higher level of care, they need a higher level of care. And that's why higher levels of care exist. So I'm just saying that
Mm-hmm.
to like, we always have to do our gut check too is, am I
Yeah.
able to provide what they need?
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is like even if you are specialized in something, and I do this
Right.
myself, is even at the outpatient, I'm like, you know what? I'm not a good fit for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I specialize in eating disorders, but what you are describing is actually, I know a colleague who actually might be able to address that better with you. And I think even just as important as a higher level of care is, if and when needed, it's also really important to be aware of what your limitations are, even if you specialize in something.
And this is something that I'll just ask you. So I am not someone that specializes in this, and I have on my website like this is I would not be a fit for these certain things.
Mhm.
If someone is not familiar with eating disorders and does not have treatment around that, should they refer out?
Yeah. Yes and no. I think that you're right. Like
It depends.
eating disorders are so complex. I mean, all mental health is so complex, but eating disorders specifically, right?
Mhm.
Um, if if you truly know nothing about it, because I think this is what happens, and I can't remember if we had this conversation or not at one point, but a lot of people don't want to touch it. They're like, oh, they said something, I don't even want to touch it. That does the client so much more harm
Okay.
than not even asking a question or being exploratory. Sure, you may not have the specialty or be able to go deeper with them, but if you don't even ask, like especially
Right.
like what you're saying, right? That spidey sense, like, oh, that seems a little off,
Mhm.
then you are letting that eating disorder that already roots in that shame and secrecy be like, oh, they didn't ask that question. We don't, we can say something next time and they're not gonna ask. They're not gonna say something. So I always encourage people that if there is something that just sounds a little bit, even if it doesn't sound like fully just asking, exploring.
Exploring, yes.
Yeah,
Curiosity.
exploring.
Tell me more about that.
Exactly. And then, if you are a provider that doesn't specialize in this, seek consultation because it could be something that you
Right.
could actually do. If it isn't something that is active and maybe it's like a history that they had and
Right.
you just want to have like the knowledge of like what are questions I should ask to ensure that it doesn't become active again or that it is active again, right?
Mhm.
And then there are definitely truly times where, you may not be appropriate, absolutely refer out, but I always encourage people to seek the consultation just be aware of what to see because most likely um you have come across or you currently are seeing someone
Yes.
that has disordered eating disorder or body image issues.
I
It's
love
about
that you
asking the right
said,
question.
yes, I love that you said ask the right questions. Um, I did in my doctoral work, I'm doing a lot around supervision and implicit bias. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times we don't address something because we're scared or we feel, as clinicians, we feel not equipped, but that actually can cause more harm because we're not going there. And we have to explore more about why is it uncomfortable for why are we not
Mm-hmm.
bringing this up, right? Like what's going on there. So I love that you said seek with curiosity and seek consultation, right? Um,
Yeah.
there are definitely areas I still don't feel, I've been doing this a long time. I definitely, there's areas that I have blind spots where I don't feel comfortable because I don't feel that yet I have like the skills, or I'm like, I might fumble this. I'm going to say something wrong and it's going to cause more harm. So I love that you said seek with curiosity, um, explore, and then when you need outside support, make sure you're getting that outside support from people that are experts or have knowledge in this area.
Yeah.
So, a couple more questions. So, we talked about being trauma informed. This is the first time I've ever heard about this intersection. Why is it not talked about, and why do people need to talk about it?
Yeah. I think this goes back to it's scary.
Mm,
We don't want to go into something scary, even as providers. Then
yeah,
that means that we have to sit with the uncomfortable. And I think that's the second part of it. When someone's sharing about their trafficking situation, that can be really uncomfortable. You might again hear things that you didn't even know existed. And that can be really hard. And that's again where like it's really important as a provider to take care of yourself before you can really take care of other people. But right, if we don't ask, then we don't have to hear it. And I think that's where we have to be really honest with ourselves. Like, are we able to ask these questions?
right.
And
Or
so I'd say,
why are we not asking the questions?
yeah, exactly. And again, maybe it is that we don't think we have the resources, and that's okay if you don't have them, but someone out there does.
Someone will.
Um, exactly. I'm sorry, I think I forgot what the question was.
No, I think that you hit on that. So the first part was, this is the first time I've heard about this. Do you know
Mhm.
if there's any work? Maybe you are going to be the one, Kira, but is there any work going on? I know you said research was limited, but what is out there now? Like, is this a new? I was studying, like when I was doing my doctoral research, it's just amazing how certain topics have such little research out there.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, when I was doing this, I recently presented in the last couple of years at a conference on this topic. And when I was doing the initial research for all of that, even trying to find other providers to connect with and hear their stories and kind of see what resources they've utilized, it was difficult. I think what happens, and this is by no means any shade to any organization out there, but it's about again going back to those Maslow's hierarchy needs. People really think about the shelter and the food and
Mm,
basic necessity and safety, and it kind of stops there. And then it's like, okay, well, you've been, provided that you're in a good place now,
you're
but we
safe.
don't think about we don't think about the longevity of all the other things, getting to that point of self-actualization, being able to have esteem again. And those things often get missed when again, because the immediate at that time when they get out of that situation is safety and a housing and food. And so I think it just and it's to no one's fault, it just
Right.
gets missed.
It just gets missed.
Um, yeah.
And I like that
And
we
so
talked
it's okay.
about Maslow's hierarchy because, everyone's like safety, basic needs and safety. And I think, like you said, safeties often do have shelter, but like there's psychological safety. There's so many other levels
Hmm.
of safety that don't
Yeah.
get addressed. And this is an issue, I think that there's more awareness, which is great. But of course, we always need to be doing more and more understanding. So we talked like at our level, but what is systematically or policy wise or government wise happening with this? Is there any movement? Obviously, there could always be more, but what are some of the barriers at that macro level? I'm sure there's many.
Yeah. I can't speak specific to policies that intersect the two. There's definitely policies for each individual one. There's actually quite a movement and organization within the National Human Trafficking Hotline and other neighboring organizations that, have bills, write bills to try to get
Right.
them passed. And so there's that. Same thing on the eating disorder side. There's the Eating Disorder Coalition that does that same exact
Okay.
thing. Again, there's not an intersection of it, but I would say, it's about getting health equity, whether that's insurance, whether that's treatment covered, whether that's more trauma informed, that's resources, that's trainings. I think
Hmm.
that's the biggest thing is we have all these different centers, we have all these different nonprofits, but then we don't give them the trainings to be able to keep up with what is going on. And I mean, I think about in the way that social media has advanced in the last, probably really decade, that it really truly has advanced and it's really become a part of generations, is there's a lot of resources on why social media isn't great and things like that and stuff, but there's not necessarily like how to be trauma informed because that might be someone's community. That might be how someone is able to operate and stay safe. And so that's part of it too, is again the training so that people are up to date with the current times.
And
Um,
you and I have talked, I think we talked about this last time. Like, we are not anti-social media people. We are
right.
all about doing it effectively, being digital citizens, so you know what you're consuming. And
Mm-hmm.
I have this just kind of came to my mind. Does age play a part in community? Because we do know that some oftentimes younger girls can be part of this, or younger females. Like if they are, that generation grew up on social media. This could be your community. So,
Yeah.
I think it's important that as providers, we keep an open mind even about, like you said, social media.
Yeah. Yeah, no, because it is right. Like I'll say that's how I did some of my research and trying to find other providers to be able to talk about this topic was through social media. I was like, oh, that looks like someone. Ended up following them on Instagram, and
Yep.
that's how we started talking. I was like, oh, okay, this is
Acting that
great. Like
way.
you've worked in, yeah. And so it's it can be a big and positive, support if and when used appropriately.
I think that's
Um,
probably how we got connected on LinkedIn through someone
yeah,
that right? Like,
exactly.
I think people think social media is just like brain rot TikTok videos, which it's not, right? There's other ways that people can connect in social media. There's different supports. So that leads me to, how important is community for someone that has been trafficked, and has an eating disorder? I would assume community is very important, but how do they
Cool.
find community? How do you build community? Luckily now, another good thing about technology is you can connect via, like,
Hmm.
you're in different places right now, but I hope that now with technology people can connect people nationwide and even probably globally.
Yeah, yeah, globally for sure. And yeah, it's so important, but I think this goes back to, you know, the different vulnerabilities, whether that's age, that's gender, that's
Hmm.
marginalized communities, whether that's again the access and resources that are there in that community, regionally. And so that's where again, like you said, digital can really come in handy, but it's really important for people to get involved, whether that's a support group, whether that's
Okay.
seeing what local chapters there are that they can get involved with. But community, when I think about community and especially like kind of shared experiences, especially when we think about these two things, eating disorders um and trafficking are such a shameful experience for individuals. Being in a space where other people have experienced that can be really helpful. And so that's where community can be a support, right? I think about so many times I have clients and home isn't the support. And it's great when home can be the support, but maybe home doesn't understand. Maybe, they don't necessarily have a place that they feel safe to call home. Again, it might be a place that they sleep and they eat and stuff, but where are they spending most of their time? What are they doing at their home? And so having those communities, whether that's virtually or in person, is crucial to that recovery on both ends.
And I love that you brought up home might not be safe, because I would assume in some cases the home environment is like, or maybe a parent or a relative might be the person that is trafficking them.
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely can be the case, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. A couple last closing things before we wrap up. Um, so, you're in this work. How does just someone that is just that they're hearing this for the first time, how do they just educate themselves a little bit more and share this, just the basics, right? We're not saying anyone's
Yeah.
leaving here as an expert, but
Mhm.
how do you suggest they learn a little bit more? Obviously, I'm going to send the slideshow, but are there any organizations that you really suggest people checking out, or
Mhm.
resources?
Yeah, so for eating disorders, the National Alliance for Eating Disorders is a great online resource, but they have some local chapters just depending on where you are in the US. They're based out of Florida, but they're a great resource for support groups, for just information and education, for consultations. And then on the human trafficking side is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They've got a a bunch of resources on there, as well as education on what to look for, how to ask the right questions, what type of questions to ask. I think about social work, a lot of times their presence is in hospitals. You might
Okay.
actually come across a victim of trafficking in a hospital, probably more often than you think. And I know sometimes there's like that screening that's, have you ever been exploited? And a lot of times people don't know what is being asked when that
Right.
question's being asked. Um, or if it's being asked, they're like, no, I don't think so. And they don't even recognize. So again, like just being aware, going back to earlier in our conversation, curious in the types of questions to ask. But I would say those two sites have, again, great resources that will connect you with other resources in the area.
And then for those that are maybe part of an organization, have you seen that agencies or bigger organizations are trying to become more informed in this? Because I could see this would be really great. I'm thinking I worked in a school. I think this would be excellent information for some of those like larger systems, right? Like this is great for anyone, but I'm just thinking some of those like larger systems, this could be like hospital, like you named, like
Yeah.
this could be so
Mhm.
important. So are you seeing more people like reaching out about this? I think there's need, but maybe people should be
Yeah.
reaching out if there's not.
Yeah, on the human trafficking side, there's actually a big initiative to, give education to hotels because that's
Okay.
where sometimes a lot of the actual activity occurs. So hotels, airlines actually, and this is actually a
Yeah.
really cool tidbit. I don't know if people are aware of this, but I want to say, yes, it's Delta, that if you have travel points or things like that, that you would like to donate to their anti-human trafficking kind of partnership with the National Human Trafficking Hotline, then they will give that to people who are seeking to leave their situation and give them free flights. And so that's a way
Wow.
that organizations on a larger scale are getting involved. But yeah, schools is another one. I used to do when I worked with human trafficking, just kind of solely. I actually used to be a client advocate for schools for the court systems. And
Okay.
so if they were a part of a situation, a trafficking situation, and they had to go to court, I would kind of be that person. So like again, the schools would hire kind of people to come in and give education of like, what should we be looking for? Should we, what does that look like when it comes to a minor in trafficking? Because that does look a little bit different in regards to the way that they will manipulate them versus maybe someone who is a little bit older and has maybe some more cognitive ability and might be able to sparse out a little bit of like, oh, maybe that's not what it is, versus, someone who is more impressionable at a younger age. Um, and so, yeah, schools definitely, like I said, hotels, hospitals. Um, this is again, I don't know if anyone here would be in this space, but hairdressers, nail salons, because
Mm.
again, there's
Yeah.
like a certain you know, kept kind of appearance that has to be kept up. And so kind of those spaces too. It's really interesting the different professions that actually come across human trafficking victims as well as eating disorder victims or eating disorder individuals.
And I think that's where our role as mental health clinicians and advocates, we need to educate the people who need this information.
Hmm.
It's excellent that mental health professionals have this information, but like you said, just more of the general population should have just some basic access. So that's what I like. I like kind of have my brain thinking of how can I just have some more general knowledge to people out there that could, I mean, anyone can come into interaction with someone that's been trafficked. So as mental health clinicians, we can always be advocating and pushing for more training in spaces. My very last question that I always ask is if someone is listening to this, they're brand new to the field, or they're just like, this piqued my interest. This is so cool. What is one piece of advice you would give someone because you are in this space? Like, what is one piece of
Hmm.
advice or a takeaway if someone is interested in this or is maybe wanting to dive a little bit deeper, like you, into the intersection?
Yeah. Don't be scared by it. Be curious. I would say that's the biggest thing. Is just be curious. Allow yourself to be curious. Don't be scared. You might get into this and be like, you know what, this is not for me, and that's okay. But you, even whatever little thing you did, you now have a little bit of knowledge that whatever you do in your future, practice, your future jobs, your future profession, you have a little bit of awareness to be able to kind
Mhm.
of assess for that.
And obviously it's needed. So I'm thinking of like maybe someone somewhere is going to do a dissertation or a research study or something on this. So um,
Hmm.
maybe in 10 years we'll look back and say, remember when we said there was not much out there? Now there's stuff out there. That'd be great if more
Yeah,
attention and resources are being put into this.
absolutely.
So we have just some key resources here. This is not the resources that Kira shared. We will have that linked to, but these are just some basic stuff too. Like we have the human trafficking hotline on here, just some different stuff. Or, some people like to geek out like me and get further into the research articles. So there's some stuff out there.
Hmm.
And I just want to say once again, thank you so much to Kira. She's such a specialist in this area. And I just always thank you for your expertise and sharing your knowledge with us on topics that I think are so important. So thank you for sharing with us and being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.